everyone to Collaboration in Action, Strategies for Peace Conference 61. So as I mentioned in the opening, this is going to be a session discussing the Strategies for Peace Conference 61, which was a collaboration between the Stanley Center and WCAPS. The Stanley Center has hosted 61 Strategy for Peace conferences to date. This last one, I think, took the most years to happen, and I think we'll get into that a little bit. And it was a collaboration from inception to execution between the Stanley Center and WCAPS, and everyone was very, very happy for that collaboration. I'm Maher Akremi, still the program manager for OrgsinSolidarity at WCAPS. I'm going to sort of moderate a little bit and provide some background on SPC 61 before we jump in. SPC, by the way, stands for Strategies for Peace Conference, just so we're clear. That'll likely be a shorthand that gets used a lot, so I want to make sure everyone is on the same page with it. So SPC 61 was titled Disrupting the History of Racism in Peace and Security. It was very much a product of internal consideration and examination by the Stanley Center in 2020, following all of the events of 2020, which if you're here at an OIS conference, you're probably familiar with, I hope. They did a lot of internal review, a lot of thought and consideration, and decided that the 61st SPC needed to grapple with these histories and the challenges that they present even in the modern incarnations of the peace and security field. In that, they reached out to WCAPS, and we'll chat a little more about that in the next part. SPC's focus to date focus around three areas: climate, nuclear weapons, and mass violence and atrocities. Three areas that you will notice disproportionately affect people of color across the globe. Climate for obvious reasons, because the places that tend to be most affected by climate change are places that are predominantly homes to people of color. Nuclear weapons, because testing and basically every negative aspect of nuclear weapons has been done on land that is home to people of color, or is then in turn a weapon that is used to disenfranchise people of color in favor of white Europeans. And then mass violence and atrocities, because where there tends to be systemic oppression and disadvantage, there also, because of all of the systemic racism that exists in the world and all of the systems that exist that prize European heritage over others, you end up in a place where people of color tend to be disproportionately affected by mass violence and atrocities. We probably won't get into the foundational stuff around those much more than that, but that is sort of setting the groundwork. So now I'm going to cede the floor to my colleague, Mark Seaman, to talk about how the ideas began in 2020. How did this partnership originate?
That was a great frame up, Mayor. Thank you. Good morning again, everybody. So Mayor's absolutely right. So for 60 of the Stanley Center's 65 years, we've organized the Strategy for Peace Conference, and typically at a remote retreat center outside of Washington, D.C. SPC conferences gather together diverse voices for inclusive dialogue on our greatest global challenges. In the years just before the pandemic, the conference was comprised of 3 concurrent roundtables representing our 3 issue areas, as Mayor said: mitigating climate change, avoiding the use of nuclear weapons, and preventing mass violence and atrocities. And so for 60 years, the conference produced new strategies and ideas born out of the conversations held in that serene rural Virginia setting, ideas that would go on to catalyze policy progress in new and hopeful ways. But in early 2020, we began planning for SPC number 61, And at that time, everything about the global context felt different. I don't need to remind anyone that in March 2020, just when COVID-19 was hitting the United States, Breonna Taylor was murdered. And 2 months later, George Floyd was murdered in our neighboring state of Minnesota. And as many of us probably do, I remember that really hopeless, hollow, desperate sort of feeling, which awakened this fervent belief that this was the time, this time was going to be different. That this time, in this context, the urgency to respond was really profound and sustaining. But what can a mostly white organization in a mostly white state in the middle of the country do? And acknowledging our own contributions to the perpetuation of systemic racism was a first step. And that introspection is difficult. It's uncomfortable. It makes us worry that we're going to uncover hard truths, and we will. It makes us worry we're going to do the wrong thing, or say the wrong thing, or say the right thing in the wrong way. And that if we ask for help and understanding, we run the risk of exploiting the very relationships we want to make equitable. And Ambassador Bonnie Jenkins, the founder of WCAPS, is someone that we've worked with in the past in our nuclear weapons programming. And that's when we got the call from Ambassador Jenkins and WCAPS to take the OrgsinSolidarity pledge. And I'll lighten things up just a little bit and share something I learned about Midwestern culture soon after arriving here in Iowa from DC a few years ago. If folks here say they're going to do something, they do it. Because you can't farm the corn and grow the soybeans just a little bit. If you want a crop, you have to strategize, you have to take some risks, you have to experiment a little bit and rely on good neighbors and partners. And then you hold faith for just the right balance of rain and sunshine. And so we approached Ambassador Jenkins with the idea to do something very different for our Strategy for Peace conference, to meet the moment and the context, and to utilize privilege for good. And what my friend and colleague Jen Smizer, our Vice President and Director of Policy Programming, helped me understand is that this wasn't going to be transactional. We weren't going to approach WCAPS with a need to do a conference, but rather we were going to put partnership at the center of our goals rather than SPC. We were going to do all those things necessary for a good crop. We were going to ask, how can we leverage the complementarity of our visions and missions and our shared belief that global issues demand a variety of perspectives to further a common understanding of the need for the disruption of racism? And if racism is exacerbated by the very institutions and multilateral processes built to address global issues, where does that leave people of color? And it was a slow start as we considered those questions without a prescription. And as we did so, I think one of the many things that Ambassador Jenkins helped us realize as she shared her experience with us was the need to level set any conversation we were going to have by exploring the origins of racism in the fields. And so we agreed that the best way to do that was to commission 3 papers on the origins of systemic racism in climate change, nuclear weapons, and mass violence prevention policy, and to do the commissioning in a way that meaningfully and genuinely met our growing expectations for diversity, equity, and inclusion. And I believe this is where I'll turn it over to Shalonda to talk a little bit about that and the opportunities for leveraging the 12 commitments in our work together.
So Shalonda, first of all, I want to ask, how was this when you came into it? Because you had the unique privilege of coming into this collaboration mid-flow. I remember the conversations around the origins and wanting to focus on the history and deciding that was the place to start. So how was that?
Thank you, Maher, for asking. And Mark, again, thank you so much for, everything you just said, because those were very valid points. Well, so as everybody know, I was new coming into my role, and it was very Interesting, because when I heard of Ambassador Jenkins and her years of experience in this work, one thing people always have said, oh, you have big shoes to fill. You have big shoes to fill, right? And I would be like, no, I only have my shoes on, and I got to figure out how do I navigate this process and understanding the work that OIS was already doing. And so I had the opportunity to meet with all of the 12 working groups who are working on this work. And I think Maher, he took me through every single person, and they all were committed. And these organizations were not just showing up, but they were also showing up and exemplifying and figuring out how do we leverage this work. And so the Stanley Center happened to be one of these organizations. And when I got into the first conversation, it was like, oh, we're going to do this conference. And I'm like, okay, what is this conference about? And, you know, they gave all these grand, amazing ideas. And of course, at first I was taken aback because of the things that just had happened with Breonna Taylor and George Floyd. And one thing, I'm from Mississippi. I always tell people, and I'm like, I always have to think sometimes I have to take my Mississippi lens off when it comes to bridging relationships with people who do not look like me, because of years of oppression, systemic racism that I've experienced and what I've seen my peers and my communities experience from over the course of time. And so I had to come into this conversation a little bit more open than I had already experienced in my work life previously before joining WCAPS. And that meant having these conversations with people like Mark and Jen, who unfortunately couldn't be with us, but it was great conversations because they relied on WCAPS for a lot of consultant conversations, questions that they needed more clarity on, such as one of them was, how do we provide honorariums for people who we want to speak or write these publications and things of that nature. And so it took myself, my team, to sit down, and we the hard truth comes out, like, hey, women of color or people of color don't often get paid for their voices. We often do all the work, we don't get the recognition. And so we want to figure out how, as you all having the privilege that you have as an organization of 61 years, how do you use your privilege to make sure that, you know, people of color are giving the opportunity to do so. And so for me, it was just all about being more open, truly building a partnership, and not just saying, hey, we're going to partner, because so many organizations, they partner, they stamp their name and their logos on the thing, and they go on and there's no more conversations. But what I can say with the Stanley Center, it hasn't just been I'm trying to be the white savior of an organization that was founded by a Black woman, you know, and women of color or people of color are in this. It was not that. It was truly, we want to be true allies. How do we become allies, and what does that mean? And that's kind of where we are. And we're still building that partnership. It does not stop just off one conference. It's a continuing of work. And that's where it goes to, like, the sustaining the work. And that's what we're doing.
So the obvious commitment that is most directly germane and relevant to this conference, from my perspective, is calling out racism and sharing the burden of dismantling white supremacy. That seems like the obvious one, because that is at the core of the conference, is understanding how racism and white supremacy play a role in this field, and how we can work against them collectively, use our positions to dismantle them. Are there any other commitments that we think are directly relevant that we want to call up and discuss?
The one that comes to mind for me as communications director at the center, and as Shalonda referenced, one of the things we were working on when she came on board was commissioning some papers. And we've always paid honoraria, and we followed more or less some basic guidelines and how we came up with amounts and things like that. But I think the point of acknowledging the contributions of Black people and crediting their work in the fields as one of the commitments was something we looked at pretty hard when we were trying to re-examine our honorary policy, especially how it applied to compensating people, not just for their time in commissioning the work, but in the time that we were going to spend in consultation, designing some of the issue area specific discussions. If you're going to invite people in to facilitate with you and to share their perspectives that only they have, they need to be compensated for that time.
This is kind of a call forward to when I talk a little bit more in detail about the nuclear weapons session, but one that ended up being extremely relevant for us is acknowledging microaggressions and their detrimental impact on Black people and people of color in the workplace, which you'll all hear a little bit more about why that was so relevant. It had to do with some of the things that took place during our in-person conference. That's one that we didn't go in, I think, knowing would be an incredibly important commitment for this work, but it ended up being highly relevant.
A lot of what had happened in the South also had an effect on what was going on all the way in Washington too. So I took a lot of figuring out, for one thing I took away from that is that how you all were able to bridge those conversations. They weren't all fun to listen to. So Mark, I know Mark, you weren't able to visit in person, but Luisa, could you explain or provide any context on like how, listening to those stories or understanding those, the experiences these people of color had, how did it make you all feel? And what were your takeaways from those? One of the most important parts of the conference that we did hold in person. So just to clarify, typically we would hold all of the Strategies for Peace conference in person, but this year with the pandemic, the only one that was actually held in person was the nuclear weapons workshop, which, as Shalonda mentioned, we held in Washington State. We actually chose Eastern Washington in proximity to the Hanford nuclear site as a way to focus our exploration of this topic and our disruption of the history of racism on the specific experiences of those people of Eastern Washington State, especially the Native American people whose land was taken from them to create the Hanford nuclear site, which was used to produce the plutonium that was used in the nuclear weapons dropped in Japan. So there's a tremendous history of trauma in this land for the people that we spoke to, including people from the Yakama Nation. We also spoke to individuals who are part of Access, which is the African American Community Cultural and Educational Society in the Tri-Cities area. And they shared with us their families' stories of working at the Hanford site. There's families' stories of being brought to that site, being exposed to Jim Crow treatment in the work site in Washington State, which was something that some of them anticipated and others did not. And honestly, I think one of the most powerful experiences of the entire conference was just the privilege of having those people join us and speak honestly with us about not only the land and what it means to them, but their familial connections to it, their spiritual connections to it. We talked a lot in the planning process about the power of place and, how this could make the conference more impactful for the participants. But in retrospect, I feel so much of the power of place was really drawn from the people who were willing to speak with us and share that information with us. It was a completely different experience from being in any other conference location. I think by the end of the week, all of us felt not only connected to the people we had spoken to, but the land itself. And that's something that we would not have achieved had it not been for the honesty and the openness that we were able to share with those participants who were local people, who are really from the land and from the groups of people that are being directly affected by the issues that we came to discuss.
Now I want to delve in a little more into the nuclear weapons session, the prevention of the use of nuclear weapons session, because we have Luisa with us, who was hingent in the planning of that session and the execution of that session. So I'm going to cede the floor to her to explore a little more about how it was done and some of the takeaways, importantly, some of the takeaways. Following this, we're going to leave some space for questions and dialogue with the audience. So be ready for that. And yeah, the floor is yours, Luisa.
Thank you. And I will try and keep it brief so that we have time to really engage with everyone in the question and answer session. But it will be hard because this was an incredibly powerful event, and one that I've been reflecting on for the last however many number of months it's been. 3 months. It feels like it's been both less and more time than that. So I just want to start off by saying that it was such an honor working on this with my amazing group of co-organizers and peers, which included Sylvia Mishra and Warda Amir, who drafted our paper on the history of nuclear weapons and racism, and our other co-organizers, Lovely Umayam, who's actually leading another panel right now in this conference, and Maher, of course, and my colleague Ben Lurkey, who couldn't join us today because his wife just had a baby. So I'm happy to be here representing our group of organizers, but this was such a huge group effort. I just need to say that at the beginning because it's kind of a running theme. I don't think anything that we accomplished in this conference could have been done without all of the contributions of everyone who is a part of it. So thank you again for including me here today. And thanks, Shalonda, for asking me earlier about some of that power of place. That was definitely a really important aspect of this conference. And I'm going to take the rest of my time here to just kind of share some of the hard lessons, challenging moments that occurred during our in-person conference, how we navigated those, what the outcomes so far have been from those moments, and then just some general reflections and takeaways on the experience and the collaboration that we had as part of this event. So as I alluded to earlier, having this event in person, it definitely strengthened what we were able to accomplish in terms of the emotional impact, the bonds that we were able to form, both between everybody who was participating in the conference, but between ourselves as well, in the connection we were able to form with the people that, you know, we were really talking about the impact of the Hanford nuclear site on the Yakama Nation. It's a conversation that felt right to have in person with representatives of that group. And I'm very glad that we took that approach. But there were definitely huge trade-offs involved in choosing to do this in person. It affected the ability of people to travel and participate fully. We did have 3 discussions online in advance of the in-person workshop that included some people who weren't able to join us in person. So that was definitely a difficult organizing decision, but ultimately I think the depth of the experience that we had was dependent on being there in person, engaging with the land and with the people in a really honest way. So I just wanted to start with that, and on a less pleasant note, I do want to share a couple of moments that rose during the course of our week in Eastern Washington that were painful or traumatic. And they definitely qualify at least as microaggressions, if not just aggressions, in terms of the impact I think that they had on not just our participants, but other people who would see these things. So one of the activities that we did during the week, which took a lot of planning, was we were able to take a tour of the Manhattan Project National Park, which is at the Hanford nuclear site. It's where the no longer active B reactor has been converted to essentially a new tourist attraction. It was only recently reopened after the pandemic, so we were one of the first groups to visit. And one of the things that they've added during the pandemic that hasn't yet been seen by a lot of visitors is something called the reflection room. So I should step back and say that in the planning process for the conference, we spoke to people from the Yakama Nation, people from Columbia Riverkeeper, which is a nonprofit group that advocates for the health and safety of the Columbia River, and other groups in the area to get their input on how we should approach this discussion. And we did hear from our contacts at the Yakama Nation that the Yakama Nation has always been against the formation of this national park. The Hanford nuclear site is built on their ancestral lands. the existence of the site continues to prevent them from being able to use those lands as they have always done, which includes hunting, fishing, ceremonial uses, spiritual uses of the land, and all of that land continues to be damaged by radiation and inaccessible or accessible only under very specific circumstances to these people. So for those reasons and other reasons, the Yakama Nation opposed the formation of the Manhattan Project National Park, which would keep the Hanford site existent, in perpetuity as essentially a museum, rather than being dismantled and hopefully allowing the land to someday return to its original state. And I feel it's important to mention that because during the planning, we heard that from them. We understood that they wouldn't join for this tour, but we did move forward with planning that tour as part of our agenda. I think our thinking there was we want to be aware of what the official narratives are as we have these conversations, not to endorse them as organizers, but to make sure that this conversation takes place in a way that truly acknowledges what the situation is when it comes to the current forms of racism. And I think that decision was much easier to make in advance because when we actually visited the B reactor and we visited the reflection room, we found that their treatment of the information was quite offensive. The reflection room, which is a National Park Service project, is supposed to be an example of some of the history of the Hanford site, acknowledging the harms that it's done or taking a broader look and trying to get away from the sort of US-centric narrative of its purpose. It did not accomplish that. There were several rooms as part of it. The most offensive piece to me and to several others was a poster called A Haiku for You, which encouraged visitors to write a haiku about what the atomic age means to them. And it had some other visuals on it, a picture of Godzilla and some other things. It was just very cartoonishly done. And to myself and to many of the other participants, it was very offensive because it felt like it was taking this traditional Japanese art form and kind of using it to praise these horrific weapons that were used in Japan and nowhere else in war. So that was one area that was really disturbing to me. And I was very glad that one of our participants is a third generation Hibakusha. She's third generation descendant of the Japanese people who were directly affected by the nuclear bombings. And she chose not to join for this tour. And I'm very glad she didn't. And in the same vein, there was an offensive omission, I would say, of any information about the impact of the Hanford nuclear site on the Yakama people specifically. There was some information about the impact of this site on other tribes in the area. But as we had heard from the people that we had spoken with already, the Yakama Nation's opposition to the project was well known. And to me, the fact that there was no information about the Yakama people in that room felt like a direct, almost retaliatory act for their opposition to that park project. So that was one challenging moment. And actually, while we were still there, one of the staff of that area asked Maher and I for our thoughts and responses, and we were very honest with him, shared the pieces that we felt were particularly offensive and why. And the person we spoke to was actually very receptive. I left that conversation feeling heard and feeling like he was going to go back to his colleagues and explain to them what we had said and where they had missed the mark. That's in sharp contrast to the next story I'm going to share with you, which is regarding a speaker that we had join us from the National Park Service who gave, frankly, an extremely offensive presentation that was at moments traumatizing for the audience. And I do just want to offer a trigger warning for racism, violence, and medical experimentation for the next 2 minutes of my talk. Just if you'd rather not hear about that, please feel free to mute me. I'll wave my hand when I'm done talking about that because I really wish that someone had done something like this before the speaker actually spoke to us in Eastern Washington. So during her talk, she put up a slide that was very covered in text and asked for a volunteer to read it aloud, which was in itself a terrible decision. And it turned out that the story that was presented on that slide was the story of a man named Eb Cade. And Eb Cade was a Black man who was born in Georgia in 1890. In 1945, he was on his way to his job as a construction worker at one of the Manhattan Project sites when he was involved in a car accident that left him with several broken bones. He was taken to Oak Ridge Hospital, where instead of treating his injuries, he was selected as a subject for medical experimentation, and he was ultimately injected with plutonium without his knowledge or consent. He was the first person that the United States injected with plutonium-239. This United States would go on to inject a total of 18 people with plutonium between 1945 and 1947. And in the course of this experience, his fractures were untreated for almost 3 weeks to allow him to be used as a medical subject. And he was essentially tortured. This story was shared with no context, no warning, and she asked for a volunteer to read it aloud with no sense of what the information they were going to share was. It was truly inappropriate. I won't say anything further about the specific traumatic details of what we shared, but I will say that some of the more disturbing elements of it included that there was a typo of his name in the second paragraph. I found that incredibly offensive, to be sharing this person's story. I asked if she had permission from his family to share this story, and she ignored my question. Many of our participants offered her very direct feedback about not only choosing to tell the story, but the way that she told it, the impact it had on them. And she basically became very defensive in response to the feedback that she was receiving. I mean, there were many Black people in the room who were really affected by hearing this story in this context without any warning. And her response to them sharing their feelings with her was basically to say, well, we posted this on Facebook and it got good engagement. So I wanted to share that moment with you because it was really crucial to one of the key takeaways for all of us, which is just that for those of us who are white, we have truly underestimated the problem to a great extent. And I don't say that to imply that we didn't think that racism was a major problem in this field, because we did. But I don't think any of us anticipated that it would rear its head as often or as dramatically as it did during just a 3-day conference in which we were explicitly gathered to reflect on the impact of racism. And we felt that the people speaking to us would be coming with similar energy, and they didn't always. So I'm sorry to have to share something really upsetting with you like that, but for myself and the other organizers, it was a very an important moment in understanding not only our task with this conference, but our task in the larger issue of trying to disrupt this history of racism, because it's very much ongoing. I do also just want to add that I'm so thankful that we had those women from the Yakama Nation Environmental Resources and Waste Management Program there with us, because they have an intergovernmental relationship with the United States government, and they have direct contact with the DOE, the National Park Service around these issues. So one of the people there was able to contact the speaker's boss immediately and raise some of the major issues that came up in her talk. And I know that she ended up being asked to attend further training and take some further steps to try and prevent something like this from happening again. But had we not had those Yakama women in the room, I don't know exactly how we would have handled that. So it just goes back to the importance of engaging with those local people. And so I'll just wrap it up really quickly by sharing kind of my 3 key takeaways, and you probably won't be surprised by them. One is that I think more so than even the learning we did about the history of racism, all of us learned so much about how different and challenging it is to be an organizer at an event like this. There's a level of emotional responsibility, not just around the information being shared, but the emotional well-being of your participants. And I think particularly for me as a white person, I felt that it was incredibly important to be so thoughtful as we did every single step of the planning and execution, because if we did this wrong and it was more harmful to our participants than it was beneficial, I would feel truly responsible for that. So it was by far the most slow, thoughtfully planned thing I've ever been a part of. And I think that was incredibly necessary. Another key takeaway is that, as I said earlier, we've underestimated the severity of the problem. Microaggressions, traumatic moments, these things appeared unbidden, but I think they would appear in any conversation we have around these topics, and it's something we need to address because it shows how serious this issue continues to be. And then lastly, I just want to say one more time, we truly saw there's an immeasurable power in bringing people together to discuss these issues in person, in a meaningful location, and including the people that we're actually talking about who are most affected in that area. I don't think we could have achieved the depth of conversation we did without the inclusion of every single local group, the Columbia Riverkeeper, the Yakima ERWM, the folks from Access. All of them were vital in shaping our understanding of what it means to be in Eastern Washington, what it means to talk about these issues, and the very different ways that they've affected those local people.
So thank you all for joining us today. My name is Simone Williams. I'm the Director of Programs at LC WINS, and I am the co-lead for the OIS Working Group Elevating Black and POC Voices in the Media. And today we are here to present one of the projects we've been working on, which we've entitled the Gatekeepers Toolkit. And this is a project our group has been working on over the past couple of years, and it was our goal to help provide a resource to help individuals, no matter their position or title, to be able to help elevate voices of color in the media. And we're going to present some of our key takeaways in that toolkit today, and then have a discussion about it as well. But it's our goal that you leave the session today with at least one tip or tool on how you, no matter your job or title in your independent agency, can help elevate voices of color. So what drove us to think of this toolkit was we recognized that individuals have their own agency and can amplify their own voices, but it can only go so far if they're coming up against roadblocks, as we've identified, the gatekeepers. So the gatekeepers are individuals who are publishing the pieces and have the say to say that, individuals who are putting together the working sessions, so where you're inviting the experts, individuals who are hosting the podcast. You kind of get the rhythm of where I'm going with here, but there are individuals in power who are who create that barrier, whether intentional or unintentional, in terms of allowing voices into the conversation. So with that in mind, those were some of the barriers we were thinking through, and how do we overcome those? How do we help invite individuals to the room to have a seat at the table, et cetera, et cetera. So what I'm going to do now is turn it over to Grace to present some highlights from the toolkit, and then we're going to dive into a discussion with Mari and Diana afterwards.
If it can go to slide 5, that will be great. Perfect. So hi, everyone. My name is Grace Choi. I'm a research consultant as well as senior UX researcher at Handshake. And we are very excited to show you the preview of the toolkit that will be available in the future. And I want to acknowledge that this toolkit was created in a combination effort from the working group, external resources, and individual interviews with the experts. So this toolkit was created with a lot of people involved in helping to create these tips and any action items that could be used by any positions within these topics as well. As you can see from these two toolkit table of content, it is organized by the topics. So regardless of your position, if you are working on social media or press, anyone can go to that section to look at any tips to help to elevate the voices of Black and POC as well. So that being said, we wanted to highlight 3 key takeaways that we wanted to share with you. There are more, but these are some of the things that we noticed from the toolkit. Next slide, please. The first takeaway is that this might be obvious, but awareness is not enough, and it needs to be followed by actions to elevate the voices of POC. It is not just enough to be informed and understand the importance of what we are doing here, but it really needs to be followed by the actions to make changes. For example, when we created the section on social media, we identify any cultural holidays to emphasize on the importance of any holidays that are in relation to race and ethnicity. And there are many people in the working group who suggested, hey, it's not enough to just recognize these holidays, but it's really important to understand, what do we do with these holidays? What can we do more about these holidays that can increase the recognition and help to represent these groups properly as well? So it's not just enough to create a social media post that's going to highlight Black History Month, but really creating the action items from it really matters to make changes as well as the diversity statement. I know that diversity statement is really important to show the commitment of the org, but it should go beyond the diversity statement to really make changes, creating internal opportunities, or even hiring more diverse candidates to represent the org is a very important key takeaway from this toolkit, to create more action items and do something more beyond just awareness of what's going on at this time. The second takeaway that we would like to share is the importance of taking small steps. And it would be great if every org can make a big event and big funding opportunities to help elevate the voices of POC, but not every org can do so. And even taking a small step, such as discussing these reference words, could be very helpful to create that meaningful discussion and helping people to increase the understanding of certain words that are very important to represent POC in different ways as well. At first, we didn't think maybe this section is too basic for people to have, and we realized that having these reference words were really important. And when we were discussing with the working group about these words, it was one of the most insightful discussions about, what does it really mean by diversity? Do we use the word POC? What are other words that are used instead of POC? That really helped to spark the conversation and understand what people were thinking when it comes to thinking about these basic words. So we encourage everyone to recognize the importance of taking a small step that can lead to a bigger movement and bigger impact in the future as well. And not every answer has to be perfect. There is no such thing as perfect. And the point is to increase our knowledge and making the effort. That makes a lot of difference as well. The last key takeaway we would like to share is how everyone needs to collaborate to make changes and increase our perspective in this work as well. And it's not just POC's jobs to carry on this work, and if the orgs invite POC to contribute to this work, they should be paid, and everyone should be involved in this process to help create changes and do collaborative posts that can make a difference as well as when it comes to positions. For example, creating panels, it's not just up to the panelists or organizers to make a difference, but even attendees can raise their voice to express the need for more diverse panelists that can help to elevate the voices of POC. And the point of this toolkit is not to create a divide, but the purpose of is to help bring everyone together in this process, regardless of your background or your position, to really emphasize on the importance of collaboration and combined effort to make changes and influence others as well. And we hope that when this toolkit becomes available, that you all can utilize this toolkit to think about other ways, as this one toolkit does not fit all, and find other ways to influence other people as well.
But with that, let's dive into our discussion over how you as an individual can take away these tools and use them in your everyday job or even just in your personal lives. But we're also going to discuss a little bit more on the barriers that we were thinking through, that we were like, this is why the toolkit is needed, and then dive into those resources as well, and how we also give examples of how we are doing this work independently. So with that, joining me for the conversation now is Diana Hollom. She is a senior strategist and legislative director of foreign policy, and she at the Friends Committee, correct, Diana? Yeah, sorry about that. And then additionally joining us is Maher, who serves as partner for mobilization at Global Zero. And she previously was also a director of communications and outreach at the Physicians for Social Responsibility, and was the founder and host of the WCAPS UK podcast, Got Melanin. So Maher, you're definitely going to give us a lot of good perspectives on individuals in like the communication role and how you can help elevate voices. So we're very glad to have you here with us, and definitely glad to have Diana to be able to join us today, because not only is she a working group member who's helped us think through how, like, this toolkit from start to finish, but also in her work, she employs some of these tools as well. So I'm very thrilled to have them here with us today. So with that, let's just dive in. And I'm actually going to start with you first, Diana, with coming from the perspective of you as a working group member. If you can give us a little bit more insight on why you specifically thought this toolkit would be a good contribution to the field to help elevate voices of color.
Well, thank you so much, Simone, and sorry for joining a bit late. I'm really grateful for all the work that Grace and others have done on this, and I'm really delighted to be on this panel with Maher as well. So I think, let me just put it this way. I think most of us don't think of ourselves as gatekeepers. I mean, I certainly didn't. I'm not the head of an organization. I'm not a communications person. I don't do a lot of hiring, but all of us have some form of power. And the purpose of this guide is to help us use that power in ways that advance justice, equity, diversity, inclusion, and help us to dismantle racist structures. So the whole point of this guide is to help people at all levels of an organization, no matter where you work, in all types of positions, to think about how they can use the power they do have in ways that help create a more just and equitable world. And where I have power is that I often get invited to speak on panels, to organize panel discussions, to write articles for publication, or I get invited to participate in media interviews. I also have the power to help more junior staff get published and develop their own professional reputations. So, the purpose and the beauty of this guide is that it helps us think of ways in which we can use that power, because it's not always clear. People don't necessarily think, what can I do? And this gives you concrete, specific steps that anyone can take, no matter what your position is, that you can contribute.
Great, Diana. You definitely rang home the theme that I'm going to keep ringing home to our audience today, is that anybody can do anything to help advance this mission. And we really want to empower you guys. That's really what we're hoping you can take away from this conversation. And also just get excited about the power you do have. Like, it can feel belittling more often than not, thinking that you don't have a say to push such a big issue forward when we're thinking about racial justice and making sure that we're providing getting diverse voices in the field to be recognized and amplified. But when you look at it from that perspective, it feels big and impossible to tackle. But when you really just take a step back and recognize that no matter what your title, position, role, job, whatever, even in your personal capacity, that there are little things that you can do. So if you haven't already heard it once, just know that we will continue to say that, because I think that's what's most powerful about this, is that we can all do something about that. Grace, I do want to keep you in the conversation as well, even though since you gave us the brief on the toolkit, can you give us some insights on why you think, having put together this toolkit, this is going to be a good resource for individuals to utilize in their capacity, in their roles?
Yeah, I think Diana did such an excellent job explaining that part as well as there are small things in this toolkit that can help to spark the conversation. Um, we can't just assume that everyone is on the same page, and it was great to lay out some of the things in the toolkit that some people might not know about and some people are guessing. So having something concrete that is available for everyone to say, hey, let's talk about the words, or let's talk about how we post social media, or let's how we create op-eds with each other can help to spark the conversation to the next step. So I think the toolkit is a starting point. It's not an answer to everything that can help to make changes.
Great, thanks for that insight. And then last, I'm going to bring you into the conversation, Mari. I mean, when I invited you into this panel, this was your first time hearing about the toolkit in depth. I know you're a signatory as well of OrgsinSolidarity, so you've heard some of our previous briefs, but to this point of we're getting close to finalization, you're almost like one of our audience members. This was your first time hearing about it. What about the toolkit, I guess, encourages you in terms of it as a resource to help elevate voices of color?
Yeah, I think there's a couple different things. You know, originally when this was first being circulated, back when you all brought it to the larger OIS working group, I got to have a conversation with Grace when she interviewed a couple of us women of color who were involved in communications in some form or facet. And so that was really my first introduction into kind of having conversations about the ways in which elevating Black and POC voices in the media was essential in this toolkit. But seeing it now, there are so many different ways that you can use it. I think about for women of color and people of color specifically, this is an opportunity for them to take this toolkit to people in their organization and have something that they can advocate on their own behalf. I think about for other people, as Diana already said, who didn't see themselves as gatekeepers, who didn't see themselves as people who were technically in positions of power that were holding others back. This toolkit lays out the little steps that one person or one individual can take continually so that more people become diverse and equitable in how they're thinking about these issues. I think so often when we have conversations about racial justice in particular, it's othering for white folks in particular, because they're like, I'm not engaging in these racist acts because of the way that we think of racism. But I think when we get to systems conversations, which is what we're talking about here, specifically in media, specifically in power structures, in peace and security, there are deeply entrenched ideologies and cultures. So we're unlearning things that were previously appropriate. And so the more that we can lay out little steps, tangible things, the more people will better understand this isn't necessarily always a conversation around you as an individual, but more how you are impacted by a system that has been operating for generations. So I think just the simplicity of being able to say, hey, you have a question, please be able to go refer here. I think that's going to open the conversation in a way that it wasn't previously accessible to larger groups of people.
Great, thanks for that insight, Mari. I do also want to let the audience know that I do have a couple of questions that I'm going to keep throwing out, but we definitely welcome your questions because, as I mentioned, we want to make sure that you can feel like you're also gaining information on how you can take this conversation back and use it in your everyday. So even if you want to give us a scenario or if you have questions, we're happy to incorporate that into the discussion as well. So know that that is an option for you. With that said, so we've talked about why this toolkit is a great resource. Let's dig a little bit more into like some of the barriers and why this toolkit is going to be a viable resource for the field. As we've already identified, more often than not most people don't see themselves as a gatekeeper. So it's one, putting voice to what's out there and what sometimes can be overlooked. But I think there's also just other barriers that exist that are becoming more prevalent and people are becoming more aware of it. But still, the fact of the matter is that, at least for myself, when I was introduced into the peace and security field, the whole terminology and credibility around expertise and how that is perceived as a barrier that can limit not only people of color, but more junior individuals in the field as well. thinking I'm not an expert, so how should I think that I'm going to be invited to a panel, or how invited to the room, whatever the case may be, or even getting something published. So like terminology and how we find credibility, I think, is one barrier. I want to open it up to Diana and Mari to share a little bit more on what are some of the barriers that you guys see in the field, and how this toolkit can help overcome that as well. So I'll go to
you. Just acknowledged in the misunderstanding of expertise is a key factor. I work in nuclear weapons, specifically nuclear disarmament and abolition, and that is a field that has been traditionally overwrought with white men, particularly older white men, and a very DC Beltway academia policy focus and framing, and how you should speak about these issues, how you should show up in places, how you should engage. And so I think as we turn into a world in a post-2020 space where we talk more about diversity, equity, and inclusion, we have to acknowledge lived experience as a functionality, particularly when we're thinking about foreign policy, national security, because there's not a monolith in the experience of a person who's working on these issues. We can't come to the table with the same things because of the ways in which systems of power are enacted across different racial, ethnic, socioeconomic classes. And so when I think about specifically the ways in which this is manifested for me, when I do work on nuclear intersectionality, that is functionally the idea of there is always going to be an intersection between the nuclear weapons complex and social justice and systems of power. Whether we're talking about race specifically, gender, you can continue to run the litany of ways in which the complex directly affects the human side of security. But for a long time, that wasn't a function of the conversation. And so as I continue, and others, I think other young people in particular, continue to press this issue of intersectional justice work from a national security lens, we have to continue to think of new ways, new vocabulary, new experiences for people to recognize as a form of expertise. And that's going to require that people who are sitting in positions of power, even if they don't believe they're sitting in positions of power, they're the people that are being called to speak on panels. They're the people that are called to speak in the media. We have to think of new ways for them to open doors and share the microphone with younger and more diverse audiences. And this toolkit is helping to provide experiences, provide vocabulary, provide tangible ways for us to do that. So personally, when I think about places like Inkstick Media, right, they take a point in making sure that they are always giving opportunity and access to diverse voices to speak on topics that were traditionally inaccessible for larger audiences. So the more that we continue to amplify their work and the work of others, I think we'll see a more diversity in traditional forms of media, acknowledging that things like social media are the ways in which millennials and Gen Zers are intaking their news. And there is validity in creating a narrative voice for national security and foreign policy in that work. And so we think what this toolkit does is it is the first step. It lays out the different places that we can have this conversation, the different ways in which we have this conversation. And most importantly, it acknowledges that there is a problem. That is the first step. And once we acknowledge that, we can continue to take steps to create the equitable change that we need. And I'm really appreciative of the diversity of voices that got included in this toolkit, because it means that there is a holistic understanding of what is necessary to move forward. So I can see myself and others being able to be pushed forward as we continue to move this new generation of experts with our diverse expertise in this particular field.
I really just wanted to highlight and endorse and second everything that Mari said, because I think particularly in the nuclear field, the way the whole discussion is structured is about strategy, weapons, theory, with no focus whatsoever on the impact that these policies have on real human beings around the world. And that is, I mean, even today, I'm a registered lobbyist, you go to Congress, it is that there's no thought whatsoever about who bears the burden, both domestically and internationally, of these policies. So we do need to change the whole structure of the discussion. I will say that may be a little beyond what this actual Gatekeepers Toolkit can do. So I'll just say that the kind of thing that I think it's most helpful for is breaking patterns that we get used to. And we all do it when you need to schedule something, a panel like this one. You invite the people you know. And if your circles are narrow and you only know white men who are experts in this area, that's who you're going to invite. And the same thing happens with publishers. I think in many cases, whether you get into the Washington Post or any particular publication, has a lot more to do with who you are and who you know than what you have to say. So that's what I think that the main utility of this Gatekeepers Toolkit is to break us out of those familiar patterns and have us think about other ways to approach these opportunities.
And that's a perfect segue to the question that I had asked Mari in terms of, which we'll dive into with both of you in case you have anything else you want to add, Diana. But over to you, Mari, in terms of what is a tip that we can employ? Diana mentioned, I really appreciate that one, Diana, in terms of whenever we're relying on the people we know, we have to really take a good eye and look at if the people we know aren't diverse, then how are we breaking our inner circle so that we can include more diverse voices? Because if you're only relying on your direct networks, then you're only going to perpetuate the lack of diversity when you are having panels or hosting discussions or inviting people to podcasts, et cetera, et cetera. So definitely taking a keen eye to your networks if that's how you're utilizing your networks. But over to you, Mari, for an example in a scenario how you would execute using this tool.
Yeah, I think actually going off of what Diana just said, it's really important to highlight that first functionality of the toolkit when you think about panels and events. It's incredibly easy to get caught in the trap of tokenism, right? It's incredibly easy to get caught in the trap of, okay, I have a panel full of all white men. I'm going to find a white woman here. And oh my goodness, I need a person of color. Who can I call? And then it is really easy to fall deeper into the trap of that woman is only going to talk about women's issues. That person of color is only going to talk about race. And so what we have to do is broaden our understanding of where to look for these people and how to pull them out of the traps of we just needed a quote unquote diverse voice. And I think the toolkit does a really good job of outlining ways to think about that. So often, unfortunately, I think especially in the wake of the summer of 2020, we've seen people pull diverse voices into the conversation and we pigeonhole them into only talking about race. While yes, for many people of color, when they are working on issues of national security and foreign policy, there will always be a racialized lens and the ways in which they talk about power structures because it is their lived experience and it is so often not talked about in these spaces. But there's a difference in applying a lens of racial equity and racial diversity to an expert conversation, let's say on nuclear weapons, for example, and a difference in telling somebody, I want you to specifically talk about race. And so when we need to think about those very easy pitfalls when we're planning our events and who we're asking to speak, because people got degrees. People spent time learning and people have a dearth of experience and that they should be able to bring to the table more than just their skin color or the story of their family. And so as we're looking, there are tons of groups, WCAPS, for example, where they outline for you what people are experts in. They have whole directories to tell you how these people are experts, where they got their expertise, and you should be calling upon the resources that already exist. Nobody's asking you to reinvent the wheel and suddenly find, all these people that didn't exist. They're there. They've been hiding in plain sight. And most likely they've been hiding in your own organization and you haven't been amplifying the work that they're already doing. They're most likely your researchers and underpaid and underacknowledged, or the people that you see doing background work that are not being put forward to the front. And so the first place to look is back at your own organization and say, who have I not thought about in this conversation, whose work has been going unnoticed and unamplified in it. And if you're looking back and you're saying, I don't even have people in my own organization who I can uplift, then you need to rethink the structure of your organization for why you don't have that level of diversity there. And you need to talk to other groups and other organizations who are tangibly doing that work and figure out, how do I partner? And I'm very specific about saying partner, because when we walk into spaces, particularly of people of color and diverse audiences, white majority groups need to humble themselves and acknowledge that you are learning, not leading. And the more that we do that, the more that we will create holistic and equitable places for us to foster a positive community and working, so that we can continue to move forward in all of these conversations and have a more diverse understanding of what should be all of our national security and foreign policy, and put a more human-centered focus on the work that we're doing.
At the end of the day, as I said, this is the reason why we do this work. This is the reason why we're here sharing with you guys. So with that, I have sadly come to time, but I want one quick thing that like Diana, Mari, and Grace are taking away from this, to just remind our audience on like one thing you can do to help elevate voices of color. So over to you, Diana, for one thing you do to help elevate voices of color.
I will say that building on what Mari was talking about, that switching the conversation on nuclear weapons from strategy to impacted communities, particularly through RECA, the Radiation Exposure Compensation Act, has really brought new people into the conversation and shown the expertise that people have who aren't part of the like nuclear brotherhood or whatever we want to call them. So that goes beyond just inviting other Washington experts. It gets out to bringing in whole new communities.
Grace, over to you for one thing that you take away in terms of elevating voices of color.
I mean, this conversation itself this session has been so insightful from hearing from all of you. And I think the one thing that I want to do more is vocalizing, regardless of my position in different orgs, I want to vocalize whenever it's necessary about the needs to elevate the voices of Black and POC. We're seeing more diverse perspective. I want to encourage myself to uplift others as well as myself, and to be more vocalized.
Thank you for that, Grace. And over to you, Mari.
I think I'll give two quick tangible things. One, when I'm writing, as Diana already said, always making sure that I'm citing Black and people of color, because the research exists and they have been doing it. And second, utilizing the power of social media. I truly believe that like Twitter is one of the most powerful tools that we have in the space. Follow experts of color, amplify their tweets, amplify their writing, amplify the work that they're doing, and particularly the organizations that they're working with, because they're actually getting to the crux of the equity that we're trying to create.
Wow. So I feel empowered. I hope you guys feel empowered. And I hope that we have shared some information with all of you today to help challenge the thinking and realize the tools and power that you have to help elevate voices of color. So thank you, Diana, Grace, and Mari, for this conversation today. And thank you to all of you who are here, who wanted to hear about our work. And if you want to reach out, feel free to reach out. If not, Maher, our great everything OIS, can always help get you in contact with us. And believe me, we will definitely share the toolkit with you as soon as it's published and ready for release. So thank you, everybody, for joining us today. And I hope everybody has a great rest of the day and to continue elevating voices of color.